So, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers this morning. We've got with us Kristian Søby Kristensen, who's a senior researcher at the University of Copenhagen. And we've also got with us this morning Nissen, who's a researcher out at the Danish Institute for International Studies. So, without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Kristine. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a few slides that I hope you can all see. So, starting from the beginning, the Danish opt-out on defense was created in '93 after the Danish no to the Maastricht Treaty in '92, which came as a huge surprise for the establishment. And since then, we've had quite a few referendums in Denmark on the EU, where the Danes have had to say yes or no to more EU, and most often they've said no. So let's see how it turns out this time around. The Danish defense opt-out is a legal instrument that covers a specific set of law provisions in the Lisbon Treaty, those law provisions that covers the EU's common security and defense policy. That's basically these articles that I've highlighted here. And then the opt-out is also dual in its meaning, so it means that it applies only if it's about these specific law provisions and when these law provisions have military implications. And what does that mean? It means that Denmark cannot take part in the EU's military operations. Denmark is not a member of the European Defense Agency, and which have gained a bigger role in the past couple of years after the EU has started to work more on developing military capabilities. Denmark is also not a part of the PESCO framework, Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defense, which was created by 25 EU member states in 2017, or not created, it was part of the Lisbon Treaty, but it was launched in 2017, where these member states work together generally on defense initiatives, including through the launch of specific PESCO projects. Right now there are 60 PESCO projects, and yeah, this framework is also covered by the Danish opt-out. Then more sort of generally, Denmark is not part of discussions and negotiations in the EU when it has to do with military defense policy. And that is both at the level of state, so prime ministers, and also at the level, the council level, where the foreign minister, defense minister meets, and then also at the working group level, where member states, diplomats are engaged in policy making. Whenever the talk is about the military aspects of the EU's security and defense cooperation, then Denmark does not have a decision-making role in that context. Denmark does, however, take part in, and that's because the opt-out has this dual setup where it has to both cover a specific set of legal provisions, but it also has to have military implications, which means that Denmark is part of the civilian CSDP operations. I think more or less Denmark has been part of all of them, which have been established since the EU started out deploying civilian and military missions in 2003. Denmark also takes part in the European Defense Fund, since it is essentially at least also about industry, so it's not based in the legal provisions that covers the EU's common security and defense policy. Then Denmark, interestingly, takes part in the instrument that is called the European Peace Facility, which is what the member states have used to fund lethal weapons to Ukraine for 1.5 billion euros. Denmark takes part in this also because it has, at least the interpretation is that it's not based in these legal provisions and have no military implications as such. Okay, so what are or has been the consequences of the opt-out until now? Since, I hope you can see this, it's a bit, the numbers are a bit small, but nevertheless, this is the times that the opt-out has been activated since it was formed in '93. Altogether, that is 235 times. And of course, this is the consequences of the opt-out are growing since the EU security and defense policy have developed, not least in the most recent years. So thus the consequences of the opt-out are indeed increasing. If I should sort of come with some highlights in terms of the consequences of the opt-out since it was created until now, generally it has meant a loss of influence, Danish influence when it comes to this specific policy. This is quite obvious. We are not able to take part in the negotiations. We have no sort of footprint on that specific policy conducted by the EU. There has also been some weakening of Danish reputation, not more broadly, but specifically when it comes to the EU security and defense policy, because other member states do not see Denmark as a relevant partner. That also is quite obvious, given that we're not part of this particular policy cooperation. Then in recent years, there are a number of sort of the application of the opt-out or the scope of the opt-out is broadening quite a lot, because until 5-7 years ago, it was quite easy to figure out, does the opt-out apply or not? The EU security and defense cooperation was mainly about the EU's military missions. So Danish policymakers knew, okay, we're not able to take part in them. Now we have a situation where defense and security is creeping in quite a lot of the areas of cooperation in the EU. As I said before, there's this increased cooperation on developing military capabilities, for example, which is both something that happens in this particular framework where Denmark is not part of the cooperation, the sort of state-driven approach to military capabilities, but there's also the industry-driven approach under the EU Commission, where Danish companies are a part of it. And that means generally that the opt-out and the scope of the opt-out has broadened, and the gray zones have increased. The opt-out has also created a certain mindset in Denmark where the population, but also the politicians, industry, researchers, quite a lot of groups are not used to thinking about the EU and defense and security. Basically because we have had an opt-out for such a long time. That has a very specific implication right now in this campaign that we're part of, namely that there's a lot of misunderstandings and confusions about what the opt-out is really about, and also what the EU does when it comes to security and defense. And then just quickly, my last slide, a few points on what I would suspect happens if it becomes a yes vote or a no vote on the 1st of July. Firstly, if the Danes vote yes, this has not been a major part of the discussion. Those politicians recommending a yes have not been particularly clear on how exactly they would use that new influence in the EU. But I would suspect that Denmark would probably take part. Now we have 6 military missions in the EU. Denmark would probably take part in some of them, a limited number, maybe just the one in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Potentially also the one in doing counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden. We don't know this yet, but I would think that that those would be the interesting missions for Denmark to take part in. Denmark is also likely to, this is also a choice to become a PESCO member or not. I would think that this would become something that Denmark would go for to strengthen sort of the state engagement in this whole capability cooperation that goes on in the EU. Denmark is also very keen on working more on cybersecurity and military mobility, which are also projects that are part of the PESCO cooperation. Then generally, I would suspect Denmark, or the Danish state, to pursue a active and push for an active and strengthened role in EU defense. That is also sort of part of the timing right now that the Prime Minister and the parties recommending a yes is stressing the need for unity in European and defense cooperation broadly, but also in the EU. Then we would also see the Danish sort of approach to EU policy making be the same approach that they would also use when it comes to security and defense, namely one which is there's this whole new discussion about increased strategic autonomy for Europe, and here Danish policymakers would probably emphasize that this is a good way to go, but it should be sort of in a certain limited way, and stress the sort of open strategic autonomy where relations to other parties and actors are still very much emphasized. If it becomes a no vote, then Denmark and Danish foreign policymakers would have to understand, or they would have to sort of take in that the opt-out is then here to stay. It is not likely that a referendum would be held anytime soon for the next decades. Of course, it would also send some sort of a signal to Europe that Denmark is not part of this sort of current trend that we have not right now, where European states are moving closer together when it comes to security and defense policy, and which was also the background for the Danish Prime Minister and parties to announce that this referendum would be held. And then I think, and that's pure guesswork from my perspective, but there's also already an increasing trend of this. I think until now, we have had quite a strict application of the opt-out, sort of to tell the citizens that we would never do anything to cross the boundaries of the opt-out. I think this would be probably a little bit less strict in the future if the opt-out is here to stay. And that was it for me. Thanks.
Christina.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Please, have a seat, and we'll move on and welcome Kristian on the floor.
Thank you
for your presentation, and then we'll hear Kristian's presentation, and then after that we'll go to a Q&A session. So please, welcome. Kristian.
Thank you so much. As Christine is the real expert on the opt-outs, I will talk a bit more about the broader political setting and the political issues that are at stake in the debate in Denmark at the moment. So trying to contextualize a bit what Kristian said. So basically, I will focus on two issues, and I'll try to be brief, so there will also be ample time for Q&As afterwards. Of course, a bit difficult when you're university employed, but I'll try anyway. So two things: why are the opt-outs put at referendum at the moment? And then secondly, what are the issues in the debate, at least the issues in the debate that have some kind of foreign or security policy substance, because there are also issues that are just about that the government is stupid or that the opposition is equally stupid. But I'll try to focus on the ones where there are actually some substance in. So first of all, why? So as in all European countries, the Ukraine war had a fundamental upheaval kind of effect, right? Everything that was sort of set in stone was all of a sudden malleable and up for change. And in Denmark, that change led to what has then become known as the national compromise, trying to build a coherent or substantial consensus on security and defense issues in the time to come, providing the MOD and the MFA with an emergency fund of €1 billion, agreeing to finally make a plan for getting towards the Wales summit pledge from 2014, i.e. 2% of GDP on defense, and then finally the EU opt-out. And I think to a number of sort of observers and followers of Danish defense and security policy, it came as a bit surprised that this was part of that national compromise. But I think I have three sort of reasons for why that the defense opt-out became part of the bouquet of issues that the parties to the national compromise decided to present to the voters. The first is that the Ukraine war in and of itself drove a demand for decisions, right? So politicians needed to be seen as being making decisions and taking initiatives. So what were the initiatives one could take? Well, one of the initiatives one could take was to put the opt-outs for referendum. So I think that is one reason. A second reason is that there for some time has been a growing appetite, especially on the center-right of Danish politics, to engage with the EU-defense opt-out. The former government Minister of Defense at a number of occasions stated that he was not putting the opt-out to vote, but he thought it was important that we began having a debate about it. And that debate, for instance, led to the Commission's study that Kristian was the main author behind from the Danish Institute for International Affairs in 2019, basically outlining what are the status of the opt-out and what are the consequences of Denmark not being part of it. So my interpretation is that the center-right parties sort of growing appetite for engaging with EU in security and defense term was also a big part of it. And the final sort of reason, I think, is that also from the government parties were a need or a concern or an increasing awareness of the fact that EU could develop into something potentially different from what it is today as a consequence of the German decision. I think one should not underestimate the importance of Germany in Danish politics as such, which has not been the case on defense and security issues because Germany has not played a big role in European security and defense issues. But with the decision and the speech by Scholz, that potentially changed. And that, I think, also changed the government calculus in relation to the EU opt-outs. So that are my three sort of reasons for why. A demand for decisions, growing appetite from the center-right, and then an attempt to be ready to handle a more assertive Germany in European security and defense issues. So what then are the things that are debated at the moment in Danish politics and Danish media? Well, I think the first and important, well, maybe not important, but a central argument in the debate is the classical one, right? Is Is this referenda is going to become a sliding slope toward entrapment, where Denmark gives up sovereignty or self-determination, or at least if that's not formally the case, then at least slide into a situation where other countries will pressure Danish decision makers to make decisions that are really not in the Danish interests? Or on the other hand, is this about getting Denmark a seat on the table where one can precisely be part of the decision-making process? And of course, this is a classic dichotomy that has been part of all the Danish opt-out referenda, as there has been a number of. Precisely the same logic could be found, for instance, with the Euro referenda debate. I think it was back in 2000. But precisely the same argument there. Will this be a slippery slope towards giving up sovereignty, or is this the only reason that, or the only way that Denmark can sort of influence European decision making? Now, more specific for this debate, I think an important part has also been about what is actually the EU's relationship with NATO. I think Denmark has for a long time seen itself, at least the political consensus, and therefore also a substantial part of the population has seen Denmark as a solid NATO ally, and that NATO was sort of the bedrock and basis of Danish defense and security policy. So therefore, understandably enough, the question arises: what will an EU membership then mean for NATO, for Denmark's NATO position? What characterizes the relationship between the two organizations? And will an EU effort crowd out a Danish NATO effort? Will it lead to a rebalancing of Danish sort of position also within the wider transatlantic relationship? Well, my own answer to that question is no, but it has been a substantial part of the debate. Another issue that has been raised is the cost, which I think is also a perfectly reasonable question to raise, right? That now that the Danish electorate had just been told that they need to spend 0.5% extra GDP to live up to the Wales pledge, what will then an EU membership mean in costs? And of course, in monetary terms, it won't be that substantial, and the money will go from the existing budget anyway. But I think there's still an argument to be raised in the sense that there can be both a military and a political cost, right? That there are military operations that will now be open for Danish participation, and there will also be political deliberations that Denmark will be part of that Denmark wasn't part of before. And I think then the final issue is about responsibility and identity. I think that was very much the argument that the Prime Minister put forward, that this was also about what kind of country Denmark should be. Right? Should Denmark be a country that is, quote unquote, in the heart of Europe or on the sidelines of Europe? Should Denmark be a country that, again, in sort of the words of the Prime Minister, shows solidarity? And of course, that's a difficult argument to be against. No, we don't want to be solidary with the rest of Europe, right? So that's also a question of how then to figure out what kind of country Denmark should be in Europe. And I think to a large extent, these are the four things that are sort of flavoring the debate at the moment as we move forward to making the actual decisions. And of course, some of these topics have more substance than others, but those are the things that I think that both the politicians and the electorate and the commentators are working with at the moment. And they also, to a certain extent, reflect the fact that, as Christine also mentioned, the sort of the general specific and particular knowledge level on what the EU actually does is not that great. So there has been a sort of a number of fact checking that needed to go on, especially in the beginning of the debate. I'll stop here and look forward to being part of the discussion and hearing your questions.
Thanks a lot, Kristian, and also thanks, Christine. I think we'll invite you back up on the floor, and then we'll open up for questions. We have some journalists and guests with us here in the room, so I think we'll try to go to the room first, and then afterwards we will also be happy to take some questions from Zoom. So people on Zoom, if you could please either raise your hand or type your question in the chat, then we will try to pick up on that in a few minutes. But I see a lot of raised hands here in the room, and I just have to navigate the microphone as well. So we'll go over here first. If you just be kind to just say who you are and who you're working for, and then we'll go. Thank you.
So you're holding
Sure.
it? Yeah. Yeah, thanks for this very informative briefing. I'm Nikolaj Skysgaard from Reuters. Two questions, one for each of you. First of all, you said something about a certain mindset in Denmark that applied to both public servants and politicians and perhaps even the general population about not being used to think about EU in this sphere of defense and security policy. Could you just maybe elaborate a little bit about this, and is this something that has been sort of documented, or where do you see this in maybe concrete examples? That was for you. And then you said something interesting about a more assertive Germany and the government trying to sort of react to that. This is, I haven't heard about this before. Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on your thoughts on this. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So a certain mindset. And if we start out with where I have this idea from, I'd say that as Kristian also mentioned, we did at the Danish Institute for International Studies white paper a few years back where we our data was a whole lot of interviews with Danish representatives from these different sectors, and also outside of Denmark, talking to politicians and civil servants in other countries. And then I have also spent at least 4 months of my life going through all documents that exist in the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry that relates to the defense opt-out. So that's sort of the data, and then a general, feeling about what goes on when it comes to this particular topic. And what I mean more specifically is that we have had this opt-out for soon 30 years. And before there existed an actual security and defense policy in the EU. From the very beginning, we have been staying outside that cooperation in the EU. And as I also said, there was from early on the understanding, both political and then also in the Foreign Ministry, where they do the interpretation of the opt-out, that Denmark would interpret it in a very strict way, so we wouldn't sort of take part in anything that related to EU military and defense. And that means that we just have not spent time on this issue across these different sectors. And I think perhaps the most concrete example as to consequences of such a mindset having played out. Of course, it's also the general case, not because of the opt-out necessarily, but Denmark has very much valued and oriented itself towards the US and the UK and its NATO membership, obviously. So there is just this understanding that when it comes to also European defense policy, that's NATO, that's the US, that's the UK. And a concrete example was when the EU all of a sudden a few years back started to work on stuff relating to defense where Denmark could actually participate. For example, the EU defense fund. Then all of a sudden there were a lot of politicians and also civil servants, researchers as well, who were very much in doubt about how this all worked out, and civil servants and politicians spent a lot of time figuring out, is Denmark part of it, is it not, and how is it all structured? This thing called the EU when it comes to security and defense. And this, of course, was also the case in other member states because it was a new thing that the Commission, for example, was working on defense issue, but particularly in Denmark, because this has just not been something in the mindset of these different groups. I hope that answers your question.
Right, and on Germany's role, I think, so the Germans themselves called it a Zeitenwende, right? So this is like a complete sort of phase turn in German defense and security policy. And I think from the perspective of Denmark, especially the increased funding, right, the 100 billion sort of emergency funding, and also the German promise to go to 2% of GDP, promises or holds the promise of a completely different Germany within European security and defense, a Germany that sort of will re-establish itself as a geopolitical actor. And I think that from the Danish government there was an analysis or an impression or an indication that Germany would use EU to make this sort of re-establishment of itself as a geopolitical actor more sort of acceptable, both for the other European countries but also for itself, right? So if Germany wants to play a political role in security and defense issues, it needs to do it within an institutional framework. So that sort of the amount of gasoline, if one can call it that would be put into the EU defense and security engine would increase massively with Germany's rearmament, reinvesting, and being part of that, I think, was a part of the argument for why the opt-outs were being reconsidered. That the influx of German money and political attention might change parts of the EU on defense and security to something that would have much more political significance for Denmark than was the case before that German decision.
Okay, so just so it made it more attractive for Denmark, or is it a sort of checks and balance that it needed to increase its own influence to?
No, this is not about sort of putting a limit on Germany. It's more about being sort of being within the trajectory of German politics.
Thank you. Just a quick one, then we'll go to other questions.
Yeah, hi, my name is Robin Elizabeth Her. I write for USA. You said that one of the reasons was to handle a more assertive Germany.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, maybe assertive wasn't the precise word, but a more important Germany, a Germany that is more present, that plays a bigger military role, both in its own military, but also as kind of like a hub where the smaller countries around Germany, both towards the north and towards the east, can sort of attach themselves. So I think it's easy from a sort of a Danish doing a strategic analysis from Denmark about its close vicinity that Germany, if this sort of reinvestment in its military actually goes through and materializes, will play a much more substantial role in defense and security issues on the continent, and equipping and developing and funding that new German army, if one can call it that, will in all likelihood also mean something for the EU in security and defense issues.
Thanks both. I think we had two more questions from over here. So Rolin and Staffan, who will go first? Rolin?
Hi, my name is Rolien. I work for Dutch public television, and I have three questions, if I may. And it doesn't matter for me who answers it. The first one is about the missions in Bosnia. You mentioned that will be possible. And I understood that it is already possible for Denmark to engage just in another structure. And I was a little bit, I didn't understand it totally. The second one is about the missions in the Gulf of Aden. Denmark has participated in a military operation alone, and yeah, that ended quite chaotic. And my question is, would it be different if Denmark would be a part of a European structure in these kind of operations? And then the third one I wanted to ask is a little bit more general. If you look at Denmark from outside, the notion, people could have the notion, or I mean that's what I hear, that Denmark is a country that sort of is very picky, and every time they pick something that they can use, and they leave the things that they can't use. I was just wondering how you look upon this sort of image. Yeah.
Thanks, Rolene. So the Balkans, the Gulf of Aden, and Bosnia, Denmark being choosy. Right. Thank you.
So I can, maybe the operation stuff is for you, and then I think you can. I don't really know if I have a basis for giving you a super substantive answer on that, but I can see that you can get the impression from Brussels that Denmark takes part in, or sort of cherry picks what it wants to take part in. I think from a sort of Danish sort of self-definition of how would Denmark see itself in security and defense terms, I think sort of the elite consensus, at least, is that Denmark should be part of this. My center does a yearly elite survey where we ask sort of decision makers and commentators, analysts who sort of follow Danish defense and security on a number of issues. And one of the questions that we have asked each year now for 7 years is, should Denmark get rid of the EU defense opt-out? And 80% say yes, consistently, no matter what happens. It's about 80, right? So in that sense, I think a lot of at least the elite or the sort of political consensus feel more constrained by the opt-out than this is about them cherry picking. Over to you. And
no, I think that's a very good point, and perhaps a very brief comment on the cherry picking aspect. I think that then when it comes to sort of our understanding of EU membership and the Danish relationship to the EU, I think that also the general population has from the beginning been very content overall with EU membership, especially when it's beneficial for Denmark, you know. So we have a very sort of rational cost efficiency approach to the EU, and then what characterized Danish EU skepticism across all areas of cooperation is this fear that Kristian also mentioned of losing sovereignty. And it's very interesting, being such a small country, nevertheless, this is always the thing. Sort of, I saw a poll of the no voters to the referendum on Home and Justice Affairs in 2015, and more than 80% of the no voters said that they voted no because they didn't want to lose sovereignty. And even though this particular opt-out is not about losing sovereignty, since it is an intergovernmental framework, it is still sort of a very big focus. So I think that also sort of plays a part in this story about, yeah, what you call cherry picking. In terms of the operations, I'd say that obviously, and this is also a huge discussion actually in the Danish debate, obviously there are often other ways to participate in international interventionism than the EU, not least because the EU is quite a small actor. The average EU military mission is what, 500, 600 personnel, so it is limited missions, both in terms of mandate and number of personnel. I think there are few examples, and probably increasingly so, where the EU is alone in a certain area. One example right now is Bosnia, and so that would be an option for Denmark to be engaged there. That is not an option now. And in terms of the operation in the Gulf of Aden, this is a case where the military mission in the EU is an outlier, because the EU mission was created actually a little before the NATO mission Ocean Shield, that was then closed down in 2016. Not least because there was actually some benefits of the EU mission. For example, they have and have still arrangement with countries nearby, so they can provide sort of a longer term framework for prosecution of the pirates. So the EU member states are working through the EU and preferred that over the NATO mission, and NATO wanted to free resources to do other stuff. So I think that there are examples of the EU playing a role alone, and I think in a situation now where NATO will spend more time on its sort of core functions, territorial security, then that would also mean that the EU will play a bigger role in the sort of close area just outside the European borders. So there are some options for Denmark there, lifting the opt-out that it has now, but it shouldn't be exaggerated since the EU's operations are still quite limited in scale and scope. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. Now I think we'll go, there are a few questions coming in on Zoom. The first one is from the Polish news agency, who's with us today. So they ask, if the result of the referendum is a yes, will Denmark join Europol?
That's quite easy to answer, no.
That's a straight no.
Yes, this is only an opt-out about the common security and defense policy.
Okay, good. With us this morning, we also got the Financial Times online, and I'll just see if we can get the question from Richard, the Financial Times. Yes. What do you think about the quality of the debate during the campaign? And the second question, do you think there's a better chance for a yes if this referendum than in previous opt-outs? And why is that?
Yeah. So the quality, also relating to what I said about this certain mindset that exists also amongst the population, and not to blame the population for being ignorant. But there is the level of knowledge when it comes to both what the EU does when it comes to security and defense, and also what the Danish opt-out covers, is quite low. And I think that actually, to be honest, the politicians too have some knowledge gaps. So especially in the beginning, I think that the quality of the debate, but it's often like that in political campaigns, right? Then it becomes about something else than what we're really voting about. But I must say that I have been a bit surprised and disappointed about the number of sort of misleading issues that have really made the headlines in this context. So so not perhaps the most impressive level of debate.
But if I could just add, it may also to a certain extent also depend on what your level of success, or where your success criteria lay, right? Because I think contrary to some of the earlier opt-out debates, which have also been sort of super technical, I think this debate of course, there have also been sort of scaremongering from both sides, right? If we don't part of this, we can never support Ukraine in any sense from the yes side, and then from the no side. This will be forever giving up all Danish sovereignty, and both are perhaps not entirely true. But I think what this debate then has had in it is been a more sort of overall, a more principled debate about Danish security and defense policy, which I think is a good thing.
Right.
But I agree with you that we started from a relatively low level, but that's also, I think, understandable.
Yeah, and then there was also a question about the success.
So the question was, and I guess we will have to say the voters will decide next week, but Financial Times asked, looking back at the previous referenda, and I guess, of course, it can only be a prediction. How do you think it's looking in terms of getting a yes to get rid of the opt-out?
If you compare at least to earlier referendums, for example, the one in 2015, we have a different set of reality, or what you can say here. The number of vote or people in doubt is still very big. It has fallen a little bit. The most recent poll was 22% of voters were in doubt. And then there is a fairly, not very big, but there's at least a lead towards the a majority that wants a yes to getting rid of the opt-out. And what is interesting, I think, is of course the many voters who are in doubt. Earlier, at earlier referendums, you could see that the very big majority of those voters would lean towards a no, which makes sense. It's the status quo. It's the what we don't know what we get kind of sentiment. But here we actually see that the percentage have switched it towards a yes. So that's a little bit different, but still it's very hard to tell at this point. And we have had so many referendums, and every time the Danes have said no, so let's see.
And if I can, I think one of the things that because I agree with what Kristian just said, one of the things that perhaps is special this time is so much other things are going on in foreign and security issues, right? So the debate has not been sort of from page 1 to page 20 of all the newspapers. So it hasn't been so big a debate, and it hasn't been sort of on all politicians, top of all politicians' minds, and that could have some consequences for turnout, which of course then can also skip the dynamics of the polling. So I'm not betting on anything.
No, it's a good point.
Thank you. We'll go to Staffan.
Okay, thank you. My name is Staffan. I work freelance for different Scandinavian and European outlets. One question for each of you. For Christina, you said, should there be a no, you assume that there will be no more referendums within decade or decades. What do you base that on? And then for Kristian, I think I understood your discussion about EU versus, or EU and NATO. But if we assume there is a Republican president in Washington in not so many years, even the one we have met before, would that put a total other light to these discussions we have now? How do you see that?
Well, I think it's evident that the certainness of the U.S. security guarantee is perhaps not as certain as it was before 2016. Of course, with the current president, I think that the Danish political establishment could not be more happy. But I think also that there is a concern what will happen with the next administration, and I think that is true across all Europe. But that doesn't change the underlying sort of military facts, right? That the military dependency is still so substantial on the US. So doesn't really matter how supportive you are on the EU. It still has no nukes, right?
In terms of a new referendum or not, of course, I cannot predict that. And if something happens that, a black swan event, then you never know. What I meant sort of more generally in terms of my point was to say that until now, we have had every government platform, except for the current social democratic one, which is interesting itself, every government who has been in office since '92 has had part of their government platform. We want to lift this up, this referendum or this opt-out, but because neither the EU or defense and security policy is particularly sexy, then it hasn't been something that politicians wanted to risk their political popularity on. And that is also why we have had an approach, I think, to have this very strict application of the opt-out, because politicians have had this idea that they actually wanted to get rid of it, but they didn't want to put stake into actually doing it. And I think that if it becomes a no, then across the board, politicians will be in a new situation where they will have to learn how to live with the opt-out. And I think that could lead to a little bit of a change in the way that it's interpreted. There are already some examples of this. For example, Denmark politicians or civil servants have participated in exercises on the EU's Article 42.7, which is, sort of similar to NATO's Article 5 on cybersecurity. And this article is very much covered by the opt-out, but in this past year, this is actually something that, and I think this wouldn't have happened a few years back. So there could be something there, but let's see.
Thank you. And now I think we've got roughly 5 minutes left, so we'll try to see if we can get a few more questions in. I'm now calling out to Cohen from the Netherlands, who's with us online. Cohen, you raised your hand. There you are.
Good morning,
Welcome.
everybody. Yes, hi. I work for the Dutch Financial Times, and my question is mainly about this the Germany argument that came by earlier. Since Germany will want to play a bigger role, allegedly, hopefully, within Europe, is this actually also a topic in the campaign? Are both sides using this for their argumentation to say yes or no to the referendum?
Well, I think sort of in general the changes in European security and defense with the war in Ukraine plays a role. It's not that Germany as such, as far as at least I read it, play a super significant in and of itself role in the public debate, but I think in the government calculus, I think it played a role in putting the opt-out out there in the first place. If that answers your question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. And then on Zoom, we've got 2 questions centering around the same topic. It's about what I mentioned in the introduction, the move by Sweden and Finland to apply for NATO memberships. So the questions are, does this have any kind of influence on the debate and what will happen now a week ahead? And also a question about, in the bigger context, in the wider world, when we have such big decisions made, historical decisions made in Sweden and Finland, does this referendum about the Danish opt-out on these EU affairs, does that seem a little small in comparison? Yes. So both of those, thanks.
Yeah, of course, there's quite a big difference on NATO membership and becoming a full member of the EU's security and defense policy, no doubt. But nevertheless, it is part of the same trend. That is also how it was presented by our prime minister, that there is this symbolic meaning of a potential lifting of the opt-out, which tells a story about Denmark wanting to participate fully and as close to the heart of Europe or inside the heart of Europe or whatever she said, and this is at least some policy change from the current administration. So obviously not the same scale, but nevertheless part of the same story. Yeah.
And of course, it functions as not the most central argument, but as a argument for the yes side, right? That one can point at, well, all the other Scandinavian countries are quote unquote normalizing their relationship towards the security institutions that govern security in EU. Should Denmark really be the only one that has a strange relationship, right? And of course, that is an argument that can be used. So in that sense, they play a role, but of course, in the wider world history, Sweden and Finnish NATO membership is of a completely different order of magnitude.
Thanks a lot. It's now coming up to 11 o'clock. I think a while ago, Howard, you raised your hand for a question. I think that's the last one we are going to get into.
Two very basic questions, actually, and I'm Howard from 759 Danish News Today. And one is the requirement for a referendum is enshrined in the 1993 agreement, is it? Because if there's a political majority, why don't they just say, and there is a political majority, we just say, well, we're dropping it. And secondly, if we just go back to the other point, is I've lived through a lot of referendums in Denmark, and they always end up as either pro or against the EU. And last week, somebody from the fishing industry came out and said, we're not voting for it because of fishing quotas. So it's a political issue, but how is the yes side going to stop this in the run-up to next week or 2 weeks' time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that is a basic dynamic with all the opt-outs, right? That for the voters, it's a chance to vote on anything else than the substance, especially if the substance is complicated. The pedagogue in my kids' kindergarten, he said he was going to vote no because he doesn't like weapons. That's a perfectly valid argument, right? So I think, but going back to on why, I think that's because of political legitimacy, right? So because of the enshrinement of the opt-outs and because of the other opt-outs needing a referendum, because there was actually giving up of sovereignty in those, then I think it would be politically very illegitimate to just make a political decision about this opt-out. So it isn't a legal requirement. It isn't a legal requirement, no, because correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the EU security defense cooperation is still intergovernmental, right? So there's no sort of pooling of sovereignty. There's no authority given to the Commission. And of course, the dynamic you point to is there on all the referenda that has been. So I think the only strategy for the yes side is to cross its fingers and hope that the sort of the importance that is put on the security development in Europe and the situation in Ukraine will mean that voters, at least just a small minority of voters, will keep their focus on the subject matter instead on whether they like or dislike the government.
Yeah, they cross the fingers in Britain.
Exactly.
Thanks. Christina, last comment on that?
No, I think that Kristian summed it up very nicely. Yeah.
Well then. Thanks a lot to both of you. And with that, I think it's just to wish everybody who's here in Denmark a happy referendum day next week. And to the rest of you, thanks for joining. And we hope to see you again soon at the IPC. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.